Greetings and welcome to PBH 275, Injury Prevention and Control. Today we're going to talk about some of the history of injury prevention and also some of the epidemiology of injury and injury prevention. Before we get too far in this lecture, we need to define what we're talking about when we use the word injury. There's actually a National Center for Injury Prevention and Control within the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and this is their definition of injury. An injury is any unintentional or intentional damage to the body resulting from an acute exposure to thermal, mechanical, electrical, or chemical energy, or from the absence of such essentials as heat or oxygen. With an injury, we're talking about damage that occurs rapidly, usually from an acute event, and is usually immediately apparent. So at least here in the United States, this is how we often differentiate injuries from disease. If you have an acute exposure that immediately leads to damage, we tend to call that an injury. If you have subacute or chronic exposures to energy over longer periods of time, we tend to call that a chronic disease or a chronic disability. We don't necessarily classify it as an injury. Examples would include if you have an acute smoke inhalation event that immediately destroys your lung function, that would be considered an injury, whereas chronic damage from smoking cigarettes would not be considered an injury because it occurs over a long period of time. This example also occurs when you think about asbestos. When you breathe an asbestos fiber into the gas exchange regions of your lung, it does cause an injury to the lung tissue. It's a big piece of fiber that your lung cannot get rid of, and it causes acute damage to the alveoli, the gas exchange regions. And then furthermore, it triggers an immune response, which is kind of a futile immune response that results in further tissue damage. But when we talk about the diseases the conditions that result from that, asbestosis, mesothelioma, lung cancer, we always categorize those as diseases, even though these diseases would not have occurred if it wasn't for an acute or possibly subacute long-term exposures to those fibers. The reason I bring this up is because this is not universal all across the world. The World Health Organization, for example, they tend to categorize some things as injuries that we here in the United States would probably classify as diseases. Later on in this lecture, we're going to talk about, we're going to look at some WHO data, and it's going to show very high rates of poisoning injury deaths particularly in Eastern European countries. And this is due to alcoholism, which for the most part in the United States, we recognize alcoholism as a disease. But the WHO, when they categorize disease states that lead to death that were triggered by drinking, they tend to quantify those as alcoholic poisoning injuries instead. So just know that the definition of injury is not universal. Most of you probably understand this by now if you've made it this far into the public health curriculum or the health sciences curriculum, whatever curriculum you might be into, that injury prevention obviously protects individual people, but it's also an important public health concept. We know that injuries and their consequences can be reduced by using the tools and the prevention perspectives of public health. For example, we know that we can use epidemiology and biostatistics to create surveillance techniques and conceptual models that will help us sort of know what's happening and also predict what will happen, and as a result try to target our interventions a little bit better. We know we can use risk assessment and toxicology, which are in the domains of environmental and occupational health. We know that health promotion and health education is also important for injury prevention and for greater public health. Now, that's not the only thing that you should do. We've had a lot of focus over the years on trying to tell people what not to do, try to get people to raise their awareness of dangerous behaviors so therefore they wouldn't do them. There's an important role for that. It's not enough, of course. And finally, healthcare and administration and policy is responsible for many of the things we know about how to treat trauma, how to provide resources for rehab so that people can get some of their function back when they lose function after an acute injury event, and also risk reduction policies are an important part of healthcare administration and policy that show how injury prevention and public health are tied together importantly. So for much of human history, I would even say most of human history, including at times still at present day, injury has been regarded as a random and unavoidable thing that if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. We call them sometimes acts of God, or we use the term accident, which implies a certain level of randomness where we couldn't really plan for or mitigate the chances of this happening. Injuries have also been regarded as acts of human malice, which they still are, obviously. A lot of times, injuries are intentionally given to people by others, acting through malice, or from carelessness. Carelessness of others, carelessness of the individual. Strategies for preventing injuries have not traditionally been thought of in public health, at least until recent decades. It was thought that if we can improve human conditions, or maybe use prayer and other such tools, that was really the only way to prevent these unavoidable acts of God from happening to people. So even in the present day, we haven't developed as much as we need to in terms of sort of framing injury as more of a product of social environments, of work environments, of information environments. That's not all just about poor choices and shortcomings of individuals. This type of victim blaming, which has happened throughout much of human history and unfortunately still kind of rears its head every now and then. In many of the regions of the world that were first to industrialize, such as the United States and Western Europe, throughout the 1800s, there was a very slow movement toward maybe trying to prevent injuries a little bit. People started to recognize some of the environmental risk factors that were causing people to get injured more often. They were starting to write about them in trade journals and also in academic journals. And maybe starting to get the idea that maybe we could do some things to start preventing these. There was still a lot of pushback against that because any such mechanisms would possibly increase costs of a product, decrease productivity because people wouldn't be working as fast. But still, we at least started to recognize some of the environmental risk factors so that maybe every time somebody got injured, we weren't first trying to think, well, were they inattentive? Were they drunk? Were they careless? Those kind of things. Started to get some very rudimentary pushes toward industrial safety and toward accident prevention. And it wasn't all just because of, recognizing the inherent value of people that work for your facility. A lot of times it was due to the fact that injuries are costly. Injuries sometimes hurt productivity. Thankfully, workers started to speak up for their rights as well, starting in the mid-19th century is when a lot of unions started to form. There had been guilds before that where skilled craftspeople had come together and advocated for better working conditions. But in terms of, for tradesmen, for people that did what we call normal jobs, really wasn't a lot of movement. It started in 1827 with the Mechanics' Union of Trade Associations, which was formed in Philadelphia. And of course, up and down much of the eastern seaboard, they started trying to sign up people to join this Union of Trade Associations. And where these unions got some traction, they started asking for better working conditions. But again, it was a very, very slow process. It wasn't until the 20th century, the early 20th century, in 1913, that the National Safety Council was first founded, an organization which has done an awful lot to improve safety and health conditions of workplaces, but also of things such as consumer products and even like recreational environments and places like that. So while those of us who work in occupational and environmental health are incredibly grateful for the early pioneers in the 19th century who really were kind of lone voices in the wilderness about how workplace injuries are not inevitable. They're not acts of God. They're things that we can control and do better at. There wasn't really a widespread paradigm shift until the 1900s or the 20th century. This is when state and local and even the federal government started to recognize injuries as a public health issue, as something that was shortening people's lives, cutting down people in the prime of their lives, really creating a competitive disadvantage as well in places where injuries were running so rampant. We started to develop the tools of epidemiology and to use that as a foundation for prevention of injuries and control of injuries. And again, the National Safety Council, being established in 1913, was a big part of this. They became a clearinghouse for a lot of the safety data that was being accumulated by various trade guilds, organizations, unions, and even some state and local governments. In 1923, the brilliant insight was made that there's really three keys if you want to prevent injuries. You can engineer out hazards, making things safer, engineering. You can educate people about the safe and proper way to use a piece of equipment or a service or whatever it is. And you can enforce. You can actually have laws and regulations that say that these types of practices are not allowed. If you're going to do this, you have to have this level of protection. I mean, it took 50 more years after the 3 E's were developed before we actually had nationwide workplace safety and health standards. But still, it was an important key foundational element that came out in 1923 that we still use in the modern time. One thing that was very beneficial during the 20th century was that public health started to officially grab onto this idea that injuries could be prevented, and the American Public Health Association, one of the very powerful voices for public health in the United States, actually formed a subcommittee. They called it the Subcommittee on Accident Prevention because that was still the terminology that was in favor at the time. In modern times, we don't like to use the phrase accident prevention because when you use the word accident, you're implying a certain sort of randomness and unavoidable nature of something, whereas we know now that most injuries, there are prevention strategies that can be applied. During the 1950s, the scientific approach started to be applied toward injuries that occurred in workplaces and other environments. One of the more fascinating case studies that emerged from this period of time was a case study of people who fell from distances of 50 to 150 feet without sustaining any injuries. Normally, a fall from 20 or more feet is fatal much of the time. When I worked as an OSHA compliance officer for many years, most of the time when you had a fall on a construction site, if a person fell from over 20 feet, certainly from over 30 feet, it was almost invariably fatal. But there were some people whose cases were documented who fell from up to 150 feet without sustaining injury. And that we learned some interesting things from applying the scientific approach to these case studies. The most fundamental thing that was learned is that, and it seems like such an obvious thing now, that injury is caused by energy exchange. That, of course, energy being transmitted from an object, a chemical, from gravity, from whatever it else was, being transferred into the soft tissues of a relatively delicate being, us, is what causes injury. The type of force and its distribution across the body contributes to injury. So if there's ways that we can sort of modify that energy exchange, we can actually protect vulnerable people even from large amounts of energy that otherwise could harm us. This allowed for the discovery and then later refining of engineered designs that helped us to survive some of these traumatic energy exchanges. One of these things being seatbelts. Now, part of the reason why seatbelts are the relatively soft and stretchy fabric there are, but that are still really tough and resistant, is that if you had like a a seatbelt made of metal or steel or something, yeah, it would hold you back in the event of a collision, but it would also transfer so much energy to you that you would probably be severely injured or possibly killed. So we learned a lot from these studies about how to make seatbelts that will absorb much of the energy, how to create things such as padded dashboards, breakaway steering wheels so that people won't impale themselves on the steering column in the event of a collision, crush zones on automobiles where you can actually have much of the energy absorbed by metal before it gets transferred to the compartment of the driver, and also bicycle helmets. There was a lot of trial and error on how to build the best bicycle helmet that would absorb the most amount of energy and keep it from getting into your skull and possibly cracking your skull and damaging your brain. A lot of this work came from these pioneering case study examinations in the 1950s. So as mentioned earlier, one of the 3 E's of injury prevention is enforcement. And from the time that concept was first elucidated in 1923, it took almost 50 years before we actually had uniform federal standards here in the United States for occupational safety and health. And that was with the passage of the William Steiger Occupational Safety and Health Act in 1970. This founding law also created 2 very important federal agencies, OSHA, or the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which was responsible for inspecting workplaces and issuing citations and penalties to workplaces that were found to be in violation of workplace safety and health laws, and also NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, which is the research arm, which did a lot of research into how to make safer workplaces, how to make certain industrial processes safer. And the research they did was often used by OSHA to help justify new workplace safety and health regulations. Both of these agencies still exist. OSHA is part of the U.S. Department of Labor. NIOSH is part of the CDC. In 1972, the Consumer Product Safety Act was passed because there was recognition that a lot of products that were being sold to American consumers were inherently unsafe. And so, as a result of this founding act, we now have the Consumer Product Safety Commission. And a lot of items, such as toys, now have to have review from the Consumer Product Safety Commission before they can be released to the public. In the later part of the 20th century, we started to expand the concept of what is an injury to include things such as self-injuries, self-harm up into including suicide started to become considered as an injury for which public health strategies could work, and also overdoses and other forms of poisoning started to be considered an injury. At first, maybe people thought of those as more like diseases, but when you have an acute event that leads to a more or less immediate death, yeah, that meets the definition of an injury. And to this day, overdoses are still considered an injury. In 1986, the Injury Prevention Act was passed, which officially placed the injury control programs of the federal government at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Again, it wasn't necessarily thought to be a natural fit at first because, again, think about the name, Centers for Disease Control. We're talking about preventing injuries. But because a lot of the tools of public health and epidemiology can apply to both chronic and infectious diseases and also injuries, it was deemed to be a good fit, and it has proven to be a good fit. And in 1990, the Injury Control Act of 1990 reauthorized the CDC's injury funding. Anytime an agency gets new authorizations to do things, if it's not also accompanied by appropriations, it just becomes an unfunded mandate and kind of toothless. So the good thing was, this was evidence that the CDC was going to be supported in their injury control mission by the federal government. And in fact, the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control, that organization that provided the definition of injury from earlier in this lecture, was inaugurated in 1992 with much fanfare. In the United States, we don't have a particularly good and distinguished record of working to prevent firearm-related injuries and deaths. But back in 1993, there was actually a very important piece of legislation that was passed, what we called the Brady Bill, or the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act. This required background checks for any federally licensed dealers that were selling firearms. Unfortunately, it did not apply to private sales or to sales at gun shows and things like that. This act was inspired by the advocacy of James Brady, who was a press secretary under former President Ronald Reagan, who back when there was an assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan in 1981, James Brady was caught in the crossfire and was severely injured by a potential assassin's bullet. And he sort of pressed for this Brady bill to help to require background checks because the shooter, the attempted assassin of President Reagan, would not have passed a modern background check if one had been given to him and never would have been sold a firearm by a federally licensed dealer. Another very important act happened in 1994, the Violence Against Women Act. So in the 21st century, trying to reduce injury and violence has become a worldwide effort, with the World Health Organization getting involved. In the year 2000, they created the Department of Injuries and Violence Prevention because there are a lot of violent incidents occurring worldwide. There's also escalating injuries occurring as a result of, you might remember this from Dr. Cinnamon Dixon's lecture in week 1, where she talked about how globalization has led to rapid industrialization and therefore also rapid urbanization in many areas of the world. And because of that, there's a lot of people on roads that are not necessarily designed for the number of people that are on them. And so a lot of particularly road injury deaths are starting to occur in those regions and at levels that have never been seen before. So the WHO has made this a big focus point. The National Violent Death Reporting System here in the United States was appropriated in the early 2000s as well as part of several federal and national level strategies for prevention of both injuries and violence. The National Action Plan for Child Injury Prevention was unveiled in 2012, along with the National Prevention Strategy, which is America's Plan for Better Health and Wellness. This came out through what's called the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, and this is an important prevention strategy. And as a result of this, injury and violence prevention is now a major part of our Healthy People 2020 goals as well. There's been an increasing global focus on injury, and also the idea that prevention partnerships and coalitions are so important because a lot of times there's a lot of local knowledge about what the problems are and also what some of the potential solutions are, what's going to work in certain regions, where if you have when you zoom out a little bit farther, maybe you lose some of that knowledge. So partnerships and coalitions are always going to be important if you're trying to prevent injuries or violence, no matter where you're talking about. So, just to clarify some vocabulary again, we do not want to use the term accident in this course. We want to use the term injury instead. By using the term injury, we're implying that there's some predictability to it, that it's not random, that it's amenable to prevention, that there's a health outcome that we're trying to seek, for somebody to be not injured, to not have the sequela of injury occur to them. Using the term injury instead of accident also reduces any assumptions we make about causation and fault, and instead focuses on the actual environmental or built environment or social environment or information environment problem that's actually causing the injuries. We'll use the word intentionality through this lecture and throughout the semester to raise kind of your awareness of risk and also the purpose of the risk. We currently classify injuries as intentional or unintentional. Intentional injuries, of course, are things that are inflicted on others by malevolent actions. Unintentional injuries are usually inflicted by, it can be through careless acts, through just bad environments, or just other things that occur. We'll also talk about both prevention and control. Both of them are important. Of course, if we have prevention, we don't need control. But we really need to have both because sometimes injuries will still occur regardless of all of our preventive actions that we take. And then we need to sort of control the severity and of the injury and the risk that that injury will occur. When we talk later on about the Haddon matrix and other things that have been developed in the injury control field, we'll talk about pre-event circumstances, things that happen before the injury or incident, that if we put some interventions in that realm, we can prevent the incident from occurring. We talk about things that happen during the event that can maybe mitigate the severity of the injury. And then we also talk about post-event things to help control damage and minimize it. This includes rehabilitation after an injury event. So when we categorize injuries by intentionality, the statistics consistently year after year show that about 2/3 or about 65% of all fatal injuries are what we consider unintentional injuries. These are things such as motor vehicle injuries, falls, poisonings, fires and burns, drowning, choking, suffocation, or sports injuries. Unintentional injuries tend to have a strong environmental component, meaning it's the built environment, or the information environment, or the workplace environment, or sometimes the social environment that puts people at greater or lesser risks for these unintentional injuries. Now, with intentional injuries, we're essentially talking about violence. It can be self-inflicted violence, or it can be violence that's inflicted on people through homicide, assaultive violence, violent exploitation of women or children, and also elder abuse. Intentional injuries tend to have a strong social component. Now, it doesn't happen all the time, but much of the time, these types of intentional injuries are inflicted on people by someone they know. It's not that often that it's a stranger that will do this. I want to show you a graph now about a injury in the United States that's particularly bad, where the United States is an outlier, where we have a rate of injury much higher than many of our peer nations, and that is unfortunately gun violence. This data comes from the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington. They're a wonderful repository for this sort of information, even though it can be kind of disturbing to see this information. What this bar graph is showing you is that among high-income countries with a population of over 10 million, those are the countries we're talking about. Look at the rate of firearm homicides per 100,000. So this is a per capita unit of the United States compared to these other high-income countries greater than 10 million. The USA really stands out. Our citizens here are about 10 times more likely to die as a result of firearm homicide compared to residents of these other high-income countries, with the exception being Chile, where even compared to Chile, we still have a rate that's more than double their rate. There's a profound social component to this anomaly. It's something that we'll talk about later in the semester. It's something that I'm sure you have all thought about if you've thought about injury prevention and sort of the environment that we live in here in the U.S. There's very profound there's not much of an appetite for gun control legislation here in the United States, for reasons we'll talk about later on. And this is unfortunately one of the results of that. So, if we want to think about the environmental and social component of road injuries, this is an interesting graph, which kind of shows you that in low and middle income regions of the world, it's actually pedestrians, cyclists, and passengers that are in buses and trucks that account for 90% of the casualties. Whereas when you look at high-income countries, it's mostly drivers who are the majority of the victims. And again, if we refer back to Dr. Cinnamon Dixon's lecture from week 1, this will make sense. There's a lot of, when you go to a lot of lower and middle income countries, there's a lot of times people will be packed dangerously into buses and trucks. So when those things have an accident, you're a lot more likely to have a fatal injury. And there's a lot more people riding some bicycles and tuk-tuks and small little motorized vehicles, and a lot more pedestrians in low and middle income countries. And again, a lot of this is due to the fact of urbanization and industrialization coming to these low and middle income countries, bringing a lot of people into cities, and they don't have the physical infrastructure to handle this many people. So you wind up with a lot of pedestrians, a lot of bystanders, a lot of bicyclists who get injured and killed, as compared to what happens in higher income countries. So we talked before about how there are some big similarities between injuries and illnesses, and in fact, sometimes the terminology gets a little bit fuzzy when you're talking about subacute or chronic injury exposures that lead to a condition later on. That can be both an injury and an illness. The similarities between injuries and illnesses in the United States was first really elucidated well by John Gordon, who was a pioneering epidemiologist at Harvard in the early to mid 20th century. He did many scientific studies of disease patterns, including what we now familiarly know as the epidemiologic triangle, showing that there's a host, an agent, and an environment. Well, he applied the same approach to injury, and some of his pioneering work explained that injury was also as a result of at least three sources: the host, the agent, and the environment. Again, it's the epidemiologic triangle that's been applied toward illness for a long time. It looks familiar. So what's missing? Well, in this case, the agent is not a microbe. It's energy exchange. That's the agent that's affecting the susceptible host, and the agent in this can exist within an environment. So it's the very same concept that we see with illnesses, but this time applied to injuries. So the temporal analysis that we do when we study injuries is actually very similar to the tiered prevention strategies that we've known about for decades for infectious or chronic diseases. In fact, when you think about the Haddon matrix, where you have pre-injury phase, injury phase, post-injury phase, that tends to line up very closely with the primary prevention measures, secondary prevention measures, and tertiary prevention measures that we associate with illnesses, with illness prevention. And just as a quick example of how you can apply these same concepts to injury prevention, think about primary prevention measures for, say, preventing death in a motor vehicle accident. The primary prevention measures would be things like designing a safer car, making road improvements, eliminating blind curves, putting in better tires and better handling so that cars are less likely to crash. The injury phase, or what we call secondary prevention measures, for when we talk about illnesses, these would be things such as airbags and crumple zones where you didn't avoid having the collision, but much of the energy generated by the collision was dissipated before it got to the driver. Front and side airbags are another example of sort of secondary prevention measures that apply during the injury phase. And post-injury phase, those are tertiary prevention measures such as rapid access to emergency medical services and things like that. So again, the temporal analysis for injuries is very similar to the types of analysis that's done for infectious and chronic diseases, which is why public health professionals are uniquely situated to study injuries as well as diseases. So I've already referred to it a couple times, and you're going to have to do an exercise using the Haddon matrix for your selected injury topic later in the semester. So let's talk about the Haddon matrix very briefly. This was developed by William Haddon back in 1970. He developed both a matrix and a series of countermeasures that continue to be prominent in injury prevention all these decades later. In this case, what you do is you make a matrix, basically a table. In this case, you're talking about a child injury from a playground fall. So first you think about pre-event circumstances. What are some things about the host, meaning the child, that made them susceptible to the fall? What are some things about the agent, or the playground equipment, that might have led to the fall? What about the physical environment? And what about the sociocultural environment? So basically, you just kind of fill in a matrix of pre-event conditions, conditions that prevailed during the event, while the fall was happening, what led to the injury, and then post-event, which means given the injury, what determined its severity. And as you can see, not every single box in the matrix is going to get filled out for every single event that you look at. but many of them can. And this really helps us to, again, it helps us kind of divide our thinking into primary, secondary, and tertiary measures, and really spells out, kind of areas where we might be able to improve versus areas where maybe there's not a whole lot we can do, and so we need to focus our prevention efforts elsewhere. And this really helps us visualize that very well. So along with his matrix, William Haddon also developed a series of countermeasures that have been refined and built upon over the years, but they still are basically the same that they were back in 1970. One of the most important countermeasures, again, this is one of the best primary preventions we can do for anything that's going to cause an injury, is to prevent the initial creation of the hazard. In other words, if the hazard doesn't exist, the injury will not occur. This sounds like a very basic concept, but it still is something that we struggle with culturally, even in modern times. There are certain products that are just inherently unsafe, and certain practices that are inherently unsafe that have simply since been banned or prohibited by occupational safety and health law, by consumer product safety law, and things like that. For example, you can't buy three-wheeled all-terrain vehicles anymore. They were just so inherently unstable that they caused so many injuries and deaths. As of they stopped manufacturing and selling them in 1985. Now all-terrain vehicles are four-wheel, and they're a lot more steady. And it even applies to small things like lawn darts. When I was a child in the 1980s, you could still buy lawn darts. You can only find them on places like eBay now. They've not been manufactured in decades because they were just an inherently unsafe product. The next countermeasure is to reduce the amount of energy contained within a hazard. With here, you're kind of making an acknowledgement that some hazard is going to have to exist, Our society's decided that we're all periodically have to hop in a multi-ton metal box and go at great speeds down some roads to get places. Or that if you're going to treat, say, a cancer, you're going to have to use a very toxic drug that will kill the cancer cells. There are some inherent dangers in those, though. So for example, you can package toxic drugs in smaller, safer amounts. You can make them child-proof. You can reduce the horsepower of motor vehicle engines or put a governor on engines so that you can't go more than, say, 100, 110 miles per hour, which is still well over the speed limit, but there's not been political appetite yet to reduce road speeds below a level where you could almost be guaranteed to survive a crash. But that's an example of reducing the amount of energy contained within a hazard as a countermeasure. You can prevent the release of a hazard that already exists. Again, if firearms exist or if, pools exist, you can make sure that you've got adequate fencing or that the firearms are stored in locked containers when not being used. And things like child-proof cigarette lighters, child-proof medicine containers. These are all examples of where the hazard exists, but you can prevent the release of the hazard. The fourth countermeasure, again, if you can't eliminate the hazard, is to modify the rate or spatial distribution of the hazard. The best example of this is the first one where, let's say you've got a boiler or some other high-pressure vessel. There's a point beyond which, the pressure buildup is no longer safe. It's beyond the level that's needed for whatever process you're doing. And in that case, you have safety valves that will be triggered whenever the boiler reaches that certain level of pressure, and it will get no farther. The fifth countermeasure is to create a time or space separation between the hazard and the people you're trying to protect it from. One of the best examples right here in the Las Vegas Valley would be all the pedestrian overpasses that have been built over the Las Vegas Strip in the last 20 to 25 years. We've greatly decreased the number of collisions between pedestrians and automobiles on Las Vegas Boulevard as a result of all of these pedestrian overpasses, along with the bollards and other things that actually physically deter people from trying to cross Las Vegas Boulevard on foot at surface level, at street level. A material barrier is the sixth countermeasure, and the bollards I referred to in the previous one, they probably fit a little bit better into this one, where the hazard exists, in this case, the cars racing down Las Vegas Boulevard, but if you're a pedestrian and you're walking on the sidewalk where you're supposed to be, there's actually big energy-absorbing bollards between you and the cars. The next countermeasure is to modify relevant basic qualities of the hazard. Again, this is some of the stuff that was revealed from those pioneering fall studies in the 1950s, some of those trying to disrupt the transfer of energy between the hazard and people. And there's some examples you see here. The eighth countermeasure is what we in the occupational and environmental realm often will call target hardening, where you actually kind of make people more resistant to damage from the hazard. This could be from dietary supplements, it could be from musculoskeletal conditioning, it can be from things like prohibiting alcohol sales and consumption near recreational water areas, so people who go to those areas are less likely to be impaired. Again, it's not the ideal practice because the hazard is still there, people are still being exposed to it, you're just kind of making the people sort of harder and more resistant to it. So while it's not ideal, it's still important. And then countermeasures 9 and 10, about countering the damage already done by the hazard, stabilizing, repair, rehabilitate. Again, if we've gotten to that point, that means that we could not apply some of the previous countermeasures, or they failed, or something. I mean, it's always important to provide as much tertiary care as possible. Think about tertiary strategies, but you always want to work upstream. If you've learned nothing else in public health, I hope you know that if by the time you get to countering damage already done, stabilizing, repair, and rehabilitation, the bad thing has already happened. So while this is important, the earlier countermeasures, the upstream actions that prevent this from happening in the first place, are always going to be more important. So now let's take a glance at global injury statistics. And this is some data from the WHO Global Health Estimates for 2014, which is still the most recent data that's available. This data shows consistently that about 90% of the world's deaths from injuries occur in low and middle income countries. And again, if you remember from the day one lecture, that would not be a surprise because the built environment and the urban living environment in many low and middle income countries has some very profound inherent dangers to it. Unfortunately, violence is also a common occurrence in many low and middle income countries as well, though we're also not immune to that. So the data you see here will not be a surprise if you pay close attention to Dr. Cinnamon-Dixon's lecture from week 1. If you look at all global injury deaths, almost 1/4 of them are road traffic injuries. And most of these road traffic injuries are not necessarily drivers. They're passengers or pedestrians or cyclists and motorcycle and small scooter drivers who are run over by cars. Road traffic injury rates are much higher in developing countries, and they represent almost 1/4 of all global injury deaths. And again, this is because of globalization leading to rapid industrialization and urbanization in many of the developing countries, leading to a lot of people who are now unfortunately dying in road traffic injuries. So this table shows us rates of death per 100,000 persons associated with cause-specific injuries according to income level and region in the year 2008. And the important thing here to notice is that high-income countries are in the column to the left. That's the United States and the other group of 30 or so countries that are deemed to be high income. On the columns to the right, we have all the low and middle income countries divided by regions. Those regions being Africa, the Americas, Eastern Mediterranean, Europe, Southeast Asia, and the Western Pacific region. We're going to talk about some of these different statistics and what they mean. And I want you to keep in mind, these are WHO statistics, so what they classify as injury might differ slightly from what we in the U.S. would classify as injuries. This should not be a surprise to see that road traffic injuries are only 10.3 per 100,000 in the high-income countries, whereas you look at the Western Pacific region, the Eastern Mediterranean region, Africa, the Americas, Southeast Asia, Europe. in the low and middle income countries, the rate is much higher. For falls, the data is interesting because in many cases, the high income countries have a higher per capita death rate from falls than some of the lower and middle income countries in specific regions do. Now, a lot of fall deaths occur on construction sites, and in some regions, there's not necessarily as much of a there's not as much of a cultural desire to live in and to build high-rise buildings. We see this in the Eastern Mediterranean and on the African continent in the low and middle income countries. This might be one of the reasons why there's a smaller rate of fall deaths in those countries compared to high income countries and Southeast Asian countries. The rates of drowning are much lower in the high income countries compared to the low and middle income countries. This is because, among other reasons, there's probably more investment in safe swimming practices and engineered designs at places like pools. You're more likely to have trained lifeguards at some of the beaches in some of the higher income countries. And so that's why you see this difference. Higher income countries tend to have a lower risk of death from fires, partly because of more fire-resistant construction in higher income countries, and more likely to have things such as functioning sprinkler systems in buildings and maybe fire departments that could respond promptly to fires. But as you see, this is not universal. I mean, the low-income countries in the rest of the Americas and the Western Pacific region actually have very competitive and in some cases even lower rates of death from fire compared to the high-income countries. So when we look at poisonings, we start to see that anomaly that I referred to earlier in the lecture. When you look at the rate in Eastern Europe of poisoning deaths. The reason why this rate is so high is because the WHO classifies any deaths that result from alcoholism to be alcohol-related poisoning deaths. Here in the United States, the way we collect our data, we would probably classify those as deaths from a disease, because alcoholism is treated like a disease rather than an injury event. But because there's very high rates of alcoholism and very high rates of alcohol-related deaths in low and middle income Eastern Europe countries, that's why you see this very high rate, 18.1 per 100,000. You'll also notice that poisoning deaths are relatively high in high-income countries compared to low and middle-income countries. This is almost entirely due to overdoses. Specifically, in about the past 25 years, in the U.S. and many high-income countries, we've had a big problem with opioids and opioid-related overdoses. We'll talk more about overdose deaths and opioids in a later lecture. When we look at self-harm, we see that in high-income countries and in many of the low and middle-income regions of the world, these rates are over 10 per 100,000. That's a very high rate, very unfortunate rate, something that we as public health professionals, as global health professionals, need to be working on. The rates are a little bit lower in the African continent, the Americas, and the Eastern Mediterranean region, and there are cultural and religious reasons why self-harm doesn't happen quite as often in these cultures, or at least why it's not reported as often in these cultures. Interpersonal violence is very tragically and unfortunately frequent in many of the low and middle income countries and regions, as are deaths from war and conflict. You see that number from the Eastern Mediterranean region, 17.7 per 100,000. Public health has a role here as well. And here is a world map version of some of this WHO global injury-related mortality data. Again, you can see that the green countries tend to be some of the more developed economies, higher incomes, and a relatively low rate of injury-related mortality. The highest rates are in many of the Baltic states and in Russia, And again, this is because the WHO classifies alcoholism and alcohol-related fatalities, all of them, as poisoning injuries. When we look at road traffic death rates by WHO regions, with a 3-year separation, looking at data from 2013 and 2016, we can see that data is trending in the wrong direction on the African continent and in Southeast Asia. But in much of the rest of the world, these numbers over the course of 3 years mostly didn't change or went down slightly in the case of the Americas and Europe and the Western Pacific. And the little donut graph on the right shows you that it's the middle-income countries where most of the road traffic deaths are occurring. And if we look at all of the countries on Earth, 90% of the world's road traffic deaths are occurring in what's considered to be low and middle-income countries, even though they only account for 60% of the world's registered vehicles. So it's that more people are dying per vehicle in those countries, for all the reasons we spelled out earlier. When we look at deaths by road user type, we see some interesting patterns. In the world, about 29% of all deaths that are considered to be road vehicle deaths are actually the driver or the passengers of a four-wheeled vehicle. In many cultures, many regions such as Southeast Asia, we see that most of the deaths, in this case 43%, are from motorized and 2- and 3-wheeled vehicles. It's either to be motorcycles, tuk-tuks, scooters, things like that, which are very prominent in many Southeast Asian countries and big cities, and unfortunately there's a high rate of death on those. In Europe, 48% of the deaths are for driver or passengers in four-wheeled vehicles. And of course, in the lower and middle-income countries where urbanization is happening at a rapid pace, we still have a lot of cyclists and pedestrians that are injured and killed in these regions. Again, a much higher proportion than you would see in a lot of the higher income regions. So if we want to look at 5 particularly high income countries and want to see the trends in the road traffic deaths, again, these are trends per 100,000. These are adjusted for population increases. We see that from the year 1978 through about the year 2012, that mostly they all trended in a good direction, where there were fewer per capita deaths every year. Part of this is due to improved safety of cars, but also it's due to improved safety of the built environment. Actually making a safer place for people to drive, to walk, to bike. Designing in some of those Haddon countermeasures we talked about earlier, like we have here on the Las Vegas Strip with bollards that keep pedestrians and cars separate. So yeah, information environment and built environment, along with improvements in the safety of roads and cars, have all contributed to a reduction in per capita traffic deaths in high-income countries. So now some closing thoughts on injury prevention before we move into some more of the epidemiology of injuries and injury prevention. The latter part of the 20th century was when a lot of public health agencies really began to recognize the importance of injury prevention and actually started to realize that public health agencies had the expertise and the knowledge and they could apply to injury prevention just as it had to infectious and then later chronic diseases. There were development of many ways to apply the public health approach to the problems of injuries and the prevention of injuries. The Haddon Matrix is a vivid example of that, but really just about all the other public health tools. It turns out these can be adapted and developed to help reduce injuries. Unfortunately, even here in the 21st century, there's still too much of a focus on making injury-causing environments survivable rather than working upstream and thinking about how we can actually take away the sources of injury, actually changing the environment through social change. Probably the most vivid example of that would be all this talk we've talked in a lot of recent slides about road vehicle injuries and deaths. We still are a very car-dependent culture, really all over the world. The countries that are rapidly industrializing are doing it, they're also becoming more motorized. We've not really stopped being very motorized and mobile here in the United States. We've not invested in public transit, except for in a few densely populated city cores where public transit makes more sense. There's just been not a lot of appetite for that. So we're still focusing too much on, sort of target hardening and making, so we can survive injuries rather than working upstream to prevent those injuries from occurring in the first place. My hope is that you will take some of the public health knowledge that you're learning here at UNLV and that you'll become the generation of people who actually looks upstream to real injury prevention. So as we move on now into the epidemiology portion of this lecture, just a reminder, an injury is not an accident. Accidents are considered unavoidable random occurrences or the results of incautious behavior. Injuries are not accidents because injuries are almost always preventable if we just have the will to do so. A look at CDC data from 2018 shows us that injuries are clearly a public health threat here in the United States. If we want to look at the 10 leading causes of death by age group in the United States, we have injuries highlighted here in the blue, green, and red boxes. The blue boxes are unintentional injuries, the green boxes are suicide, and the red boxes are homicide. You'll probably notice that from age 1 to 44, the leading cause of death is unintentional injury. These would be things like motor vehicle crashes or many of the other things that often strike down people relatively early in life. When you get past the age of 44, it tends to be malignant neoplasms and heart disease, some of the chronic diseases that are often the leading cause of death. But you can see across all groups, injuries play a large part in what's killing Americans. So on this graph, we're taking all of those unintentional injury deaths that appeared in the blue boxes in the previous graph, and we're dividing them up a little bit more into the specific causes of each unintentional injury death. What we see from here is that for those who are basically newborn to age 1, the unintentional injury death that is most common is suffocation. This would be things like sudden infant death syndrome, or rolling over and suffocating. Then unintentional drowning, unintentional motor vehicle traffic accidents, unintentional poisoning. By the time you get to age 15 all the way through age 64, these would be mostly overdoses. That becomes a leading cause of death, the leading cause of unintentional injury death anyway. So in this graph, we're highlighting the intentional or violence-related injury deaths in the United States in the year 2018 by age group, with the types of homicide highlighted in red, the types of suicide highlighted in green. Here we see some very sad and disturbing data that, for example, the number one cause of violence-related injury death for those aged 10 to 14 is suicide by suffocation. Generally, that means hanging. Suicide by firearm is unfortunately very common in the United States because of the ready availability of firearms and sort of the cultural acceptance of firearms. We see that homicide can strike people at lots of different ages, even the youngest of us. One thing that I find interesting is that if you look down at the very bottom, in the age group 15 to 24, that suicide by falls, actually there are enough cases of that for it to show up. Like 205 in the year 2018. The teenage years are kind of difficult for a lot of people, and it's a time when impulse control isn't fully developed, and it's an interesting phenomenon you see in a lot of places where kids of a certain age, sometimes inspired by culture, sometimes inspired by other frustrations, they will actually jump off of high things. This is very unfortunately common in the San Francisco Bay Area, specifically on the Golden Gate Bridge. More than 1,700 people have jumped to their death off the Golden Gate Bridge. Almost all of them were in this unique and fragile age group between 15 and 24. I just think that's very, very unusual and really jumps out. It's really sad to see that our culture that starting at age 10, that suicidal ideation starts to become a thing. It's generally not a thing before about age 10, but then after that, it becomes a thing and it becomes an all too common form of violence-related injury death. This next slide involves a little bit of estimation because we don't always have perfect data on hospital and emergency room admissions as to why it is that the patient is being admitted, what specifically caused them to be in this condition. But some extrapolations are made, and it appears that in the year 2017, the leading cause of non-fatal injuries, again, non-fatal injuries where people have to be treated in an emergency department, is fairly consistently falls. What's interesting here is if you look at the total raw numbers, obviously for young children, you can fall out of a crib, you can fall off of a piece of playground equipment, and depending on how high it is, that can result in a trip to the emergency department. But as people get older, like starting with age 45 and all the way to 65 plus, look at how the total numbers of people admitted to emergency departments for fall-related injuries goes up. There are almost 3 million people treated for fall-related emergencies in the year 2017 that are over age 65. And of course, this probably makes sense to you if you think about it. As we get older, we become a little bit more susceptible to falls because of balance and vestibular issues. And also, we don't heal as quickly. A fall to the same level can be catastrophic for a person who's over age 65, particularly if it involves breaking their hip. So that's one of the more interesting things from this, that it's not actually motor vehicle crashes that are the leading cause of non-fatal injuries treated in emergency departments. For almost all ages excepting age 10 to 24, the leading cause is falls. So all this to say, we have a pretty big problem in the United States with injuries causing not only mortality but also morbidity. Injuries are the leading cause of death for people up to the age of 44, and almost 200,000 Americans die every year due to injuries. In terms of morbidity, meaning short or long-term disability or loss of function that occurs as a result of injury, even though the person lives, there's almost 40 million injury cases that seek medical treatment in the United States every year. Injuries cause more deaths among those aged 10 to 34 years old than all other causes of death combined. Here are a couple of very common visualizations used for the problem with injuries. And I think these can both kind of help you grasp the idea that why upstream interventions are so important, why if we can remove some of the causative factors that are leading to injuries, actually remove them from our society, we can have such a huge impact, not just on bringing death rates down, but also improving the quality of life. Because at the very top of the pyramid, or the tip of the iceberg, are the injuries that result in death. Every year, 157,000 of those or so happen. But underneath that, there's about a 10-to-1 ratio of injuries resulting in hospitalization, but not death, as opposed to injuries resulting in death. So for every one death, there's about 10 similar injuries resulting in hospitalization. Those are sort of the top of the iceberg, the part you see above the water, or the top of the pyramid. But then there's a lot of other injuries that they don't require in-person hospitalization, but they might require a physician's office visit or an emergency department visit where you're not admitted but you're treated, or even injuries that are treated at home or not treated. It's estimated that for every one injury death, there's about 178 of these injuries that are outpatient treated or treated at home, or if people don't have access to healthcare are simply not treated at all, and you take your chances with it healing up or not healing up. So this is why we need to try to work upstream to remove these injurious factors before they impact people, because you can be impacted, far more people are impacted than just the ones who die. One undeniable public health fact about injuries is that they disproportionately affect people earlier in life. Therefore, they have a profound impact on years of potential life lost when somebody dies of an injury. We'll talk about the concept of years of potential life lost in a little more detail shortly, though it's a concept that most of you that have been in public health for a while should already have a pretty good grasp of. If we look at ages 1 through 4, we see that almost 42% of all deaths in that age range are due to injury, in this case due to either unintentional injury or homicide. So when you get into the next range, ages 5 through 9, you see that injuries still represent more than 1/3 of all deaths, but the proportion is just a little bit less than it is through ages 1 through 4, in this case 36.3%. We also get a slight reduction in congenital anomalies as a source of death. But by the time you start to reach ages 5 to 9, you're a little bit more susceptible to some of the chronic diseases that normally only happen later in life. When you get to the age group of 10 to 14, you see that injury becomes the predominant source of death. In this case, almost 60%, driven by high rates of unintentional injury and homicide. And when you get into this age group, you start to see suicide emerging as a source of injury death as well. By far, the age range with the highest rate of unintentional injury death, or really all injury death, is ages 15 to 24. And there are many reasons for this. The adolescent years are when a lot of coming of age happens. A lot of people start driving for the first time. A lot of people start to engage in social activities that weren't available to them when they were younger. This is unfortunately a time when suicide rates tend to be relatively high, and also homicide rates. And when you add all these up, it adds up to over 73% of all people who die in the U.S. between ages of 15 and 24 die as a result of intentional or unintentional injuries. In the next age range, 25 to 34, you still have almost 60% of all deaths in this range being due to injuries, but it's less than it was in 15 to 24 just because when you reach this age, more people start succumbing to chronic diseases such as malignant neoplasms or cancers, heart disease, and diabetes. And in this case also, HIV starts to make an appearance on the graph as well. And by the time you reach ages 35 to 44, injuries are still responsible for almost 35% of all deaths in this range, but multiple chronic diseases are starting to make themselves known on the graph, and it's kind of that's why proportionally you see fewer injury deaths in this age group. So if we want to put this in terms of years of potential life lost, or YPLL, meaning things that kill people before the age of 65, we'll see that unintentional injury is responsible for 23% of the years of potential life lost in our culture in the year 2016. Suicide is the fourth leading cause of years of potential life lost. Homicide is number 6. And though malignant neoplasms and heart disease also have a significant role to play here, you'll see that there's still far fewer years of potential life lost due to those than there is due to unintentional injury. So this is why we need to treat it like the public health crisis that it is. So now I'll discuss some of the demographics of injuries, and you'll see that there's some health disparities in our culture. Injuries do not equally affect everybody. The first one will probably not come as a surprise to you, that those who are born male, who identify as male, tend to have higher rates of both fatal and non-fatal injuries. There are cultural reasons for this. There could also possibly be hormonal reasons, as oftentimes people with elevated levels of testosterone will tend to engage in more high-risk behavior. And again, there's sometimes cultural factors where, a couple of people encouraging other people to take risks can have quite a profound impact on the risks that people take, and sometimes it can be fatal risks that are taken as a result of dares or peer pressure or things like that. There are racial differences in fatal and non-fatal injuries. A lot of this has to do with built environments. There's a lot of times the roads and the playground equipment and the schools in lower income neighborhoods where sometimes there's more racial minorities that live there are just more dangerous than the built environments in higher income neighborhoods that tend to be wider. We know that unintentional injury death rates increase as income decreases. This is just, again, a lot of it has to do with the built environment. A lot of it has to do with information environment. A lot of it has to do with social environment. We know that homicide rates increase as income decreases. Therefore, people in their lower socioeconomic status rungs, who are usually disproportionately minorities as well, suffer from higher rates of homicides. We know that unintentional injury rates are higher in rural areas compared to urban areas, which might seem like a strange paradox until you think about in rural areas, there's a lot more dangerous activities such as farming and mowing and things like that happen, where activities that have very high rates of injury. We know that homicide rates are higher in urban areas and suicide rates are higher in rural areas. This is something these are phenomena that existed even before the present opioid epidemic, which has really driven high rates of both suicide and unintentional injury in rural areas. So the data I'm about to present all comes from before the COVID-19 pandemic era, because certainly COVID-19 has skewed and distorted our mortality data here in the United States and in many other parts of the world. But before COVID, on an average day in the United States, there would be 547 people dying from an injury. That's one person every 3 minutes. By comparison, 680 people would die of heart disease in a given day. So you see that the number of people dying of injury is almost equal to the number of people dying of heart disease. On an average day, again pre-COVID, before our hospitals got full of COVID patients, 5,000 people would be discharged from a hospital after treatment for a non-fatal injury. And about 400,000 people would visit a physician, an emergency department, or an outpatient facility for an injury-related health issue. So that's a lot of injury. That's a lot of human suffering. It's also a lot of cost. It's a major drain on healthcare dollars. It's estimated that the cost of injury roughly equals the cost of heart disease, because some injuries, the treatments for them can be very expensive. It's hard to completely estimate the cost of injury, because you have to consider both the direct medical costs, you have to consider the indirect costs of lost productivity, you have to consider the cost of disfigurement. And a lot of times in the insurance industry, they have to do things like this. They have little actuarial data where they apply, like if you lose a finger or if you lose the function of an arm, there's actually a compensable amount that you'll be entitled to if that happens as a result of somebody else's negligence or from no fault systems such as workers' compensation. But it's never real easy to completely estimate the cost of injury, but the CDC gave it a try back in 2013, and their estimate was that in the year 2013, the lifetime cost of injury, meaning the cost for the acute care and then also for any aftercare that results after the injury, was $671 billion, and that's just from 1 year. And again, that's an estimate from the CDC WISCAR's data. So yes, besides the human suffering cost, there's also a big monetary cost that's happening as a result of injury. So I've talked a lot about how injury is clearly a major public health threat. It's a major societal issue. So therefore, you probably think, so it must be at the top of the list of issues that are being dealt with aggressively, right? Public health must be really focused on this, along with state and local governments and people who care about health and well-being. Well, unfortunately, no. Injuries and injury prevention have really not received the attention that they've probably deserved based on the proportion of death, disability, suffering, and monetary costs that are incurred from them. I'll go over some of the reasons why this is the case now. So if we want to start with why injuries are the neglected epidemic, we have to go all the way back to the whole injury and accident discussion we had earlier and that we've thought of many times. A lot of people in our culture still see injuries being a result of random, uncontrollable events. They were bad luck, or they were an accident. It's also been seen that a lot of times we associate injuries with risk-taking behavior, and that therefore it's something that, we're not responsible for what people do that's dangerous, they should have known not to do. We glorify risk-taking somewhat in our culture, particularly in the realm of sports, where people risk at times gruesome and at times life-threatening injuries in order to perform a sport at the highest level. Not just ball and puck sports, but things like motorsports as well, and swimming and Olympic sports. There are real risk of severe injuries and death from a lot of these sports, but we kind of glorify that risk-taking in our current culture. Another part of it, too, is that injuries are so common, our culture just kind of gets numb to it. We only think about injuries whenever there's dramatic injury events that occur with multiple deaths. Things such as when planes crash or when there's a terrorism event like what happened back in 9/11. The fact, though, is that most of the time when people die of injuries, it's very common things that happen. Falling off a ladder, colliding with having a car crash into you. Just little things that don't necessarily make the news, but that are responsible for the vast majority of the injuries that are happening in this neglected epidemic. Another factor is that we are a market-driven society. A lot of times, if you want to make a product safer, or a system safer, or a workplace safer, or a building, or a national park, or whatever it is, there's going to be some outlay of cost to do that. And the question becomes, who pays for prevention? If you want to prevent injuries from occurring later on by spending money right now, that's a good and noble thing, but the people who have to pay right now might not see it that way. Many industries, for example, have been unwilling to incorporate new safety technology because it would cut into the short-term profits. For an example of this, let's look to the automobile industry here in the United States. Cars basically became available starting around the 1920s after Henry Ford perfected the assembly line. And for many decades after that, Americans just kind of accepted the fact that cars were basically rolling death boxes, and that, if you got into a collision, pretty good chance you were going to die. People just kind of looked at the advantages that cars in a mobile society provided them and assumed that we just have to deal with the risk and, make do the best we can with it. Well, that kind of changed in 1965. When consumer advocate Ralph Nader published a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, The Designed-In Dangers of the American Automobile. Now, the name Ralph Nader might be familiar to you because he's still alive, and in fact, as recently as a few years ago, he was still periodically running for president on the Green Party ticket and also still being a visible consumer safety advocate. But what Ralph Nader showed way back in 1965 using some of the auto industry's own data was that auto manufacturers knew how to build a car safer. They knew how to make it less dangerous for its occupants. The problem was, if they did so, the car would be heavier and therefore not perform as well, wouldn't go as fast, and would also be more expensive. And none of the major automakers at the time wanted to be the first people to integrate these known safety improvements because their competitors would be able to undercut them on price then. What this unfortunately does is it kind of means that consumers were stuck for many years with cars that were more dangerous than they needed to be. And this is where federal regulation is so important. As a result of the demand from the public that these car manufacturers start making their cars safer, Ralph Nader specifically wrote about the Chevy Corvair, which is pictured here, a rear-engine car that, you never want to be in a collision in one of these. It would not turn out well for you. But because of the outcry from citizens once they realized that cars were not being made as safe as they could, was that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration was founded. They were created and then they were empowered to set standards for auto safety so that, yes, you could still try to make a cheaper car than your competitor, but everybody's cars would have to have breakaway steering wheels and seat belts and other features such as radial tires. I mean, there were certain baseline levels of safety that all manufacturers were forced to put into their cars, where, this was a result of pressure put on originally by Ralph Nader and then subsequently by consumers who became educated about this. Along with the belief that injuries and accidents are synonymous and that injuries can't really be prevented, our culture often still has the attitude of victim blaming too, that if you hurt yourself, it surely must have been because of stupid or careless behavior. I can tell you in the occupational safety and health world, this is still what a lot of plant managers and other supervisors still do, rather than exploring how product designs or workplace layouts or things like that could be improved. But instead, victims are often criticized for not using things properly rather than looking at the design of things. Again, we need to focus our attentions more upstream. As I kind of alluded to earlier, it's not just the public, but also the media often will not give attention to routine injury events. Sometimes it's hard to get local stories about the need for a crosswalk, for example. But it's easy to get media stories about a wonder drug or other medical breakthroughs. This is just one of those information deficiencies that happens in our culture. Some of the most passionate, highly educated, and people who can have the best ideas for what really works to prevent injuries also work for state agencies or universities and are therefore not allowed to directly lobby policymakers. They can indirectly lobby policymakers through advocacy coalitions, and this is often done, but it's not quite the same as the manufacturer that doesn't want a new regulation on its product can directly lobby policymakers, and that's an unfortunate difference. There's a general lack of information and interest among public and medical professionals about injuries. This is a shocking but true statistic. Only 18% of pediatricians, these are people who go into training, into medical training specifically to treat the unique needs of younger adults, children. Only about 18% of them receive drowning prevention education in school. They might know how to treat a patient who comes in after having been pulled out of a pool or a river or an ocean, but only 18% of them receive drowning prevention education in school that they can then pass on to their pediatric patients or the parents of their pediatric patients. This is a big information deficiency that needs to be corrected. Sometimes the science and the evidence clashes with ideology when we're talking about injuries, and a clear example of this is the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention would be the logical agency in the United States government to study the effects of gun violence, some of the factors in gun violence, some of the preventive strategies for gun violence. But back in 1997, there was an amendment added to the funding for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention called the Dickey Amendment. This amendment implied, it didn't necessarily directly state it, but it implied that there could be funding withheld from the CDC if there was any attempt to fund research that had to do with gun violence or gun control or anything like that. It wasn't until 2020 that it was finally clarified, the legislative intent that no, the CDC can go ahead and do gun violence and gun control research without having to worry about having their funding cut. But for 23 years, people at the CDC who wanted to look into this topic were scared to do so because they didn't want their agency to lose funding. So this is just one of those. This does happen periodically, and thankfully, this particular one might be in the rearview mirror now. We sometimes don't have the data we needed too, especially at the local level. The injury surveillance data, this lack of data can make it difficult to identify, understand, and prevent the problems. Sometimes we realize that there's I guess we call it outbreak of injuries occurring in certain communities and neighborhoods, but it takes an unusual number of events to occur before action might be taken just because local data is limited. In general, public health funding is limited, not just for injury prevention, but for everything, really. It's estimated that of all the spending that's done to try to improve the health and well-being of citizens in the United States, only about 3% of it is spent on public health. If we look at that as a number of the dollars spent per person per year, about $251 is spent for every person in the U.S. on public health per year, versus over $8,000 per person per year spent on medicine and medical care. We also know that between the years 2005 and 2013, the CDC budget decreased 15% during that time. This wasn't in response to punishment for gun control research or anything like that. It was just, it was considered hard budget times, and therefore tough choices had to be made, and unfortunately the CDC was the recipient of some cuts. Now in 2010, the Prevention and Public Health Fund, which was part of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, was put into place. This was a fund that helped people to be able to afford things such as preventive screenings for the first time in many of their lives, which obviously has helped public health a lot. The more early screenings and detection you can get for certain specific disease states, the better your outcome will be. The problem is the Prevention and Public Health Fund, while it has helped, has been under constant threat of repeal and rollback. It hasn't been repealed yet, but it's been a target for many administrations since then. When the Healthy People 2020 goals were published a few years back, injury and violence prevention was a major topic of them. And if you're interested in that, you can look at the hyperlink here. But it's good to have goals that include injury and violence prevention, because when you have goals and you're measuring toward those goals, that's a lot of times when progress happens. It's when you're not measuring something and not paying attention to it that often you don't get progress. When you're in public health, you realize that many things are affected by social influences, including injury rates. It is the task of public health to monitor and create solutions to many injury issues. However, there's also society which in some cases pushes people in directions that maybe public health would not want them to go. For example, it's current societal preference here in the United States that road infrastructure should be designed for efficiency of moving people and goods at high speeds. This is why a lot of urban neighborhoods have high-speed interstates going through them. And part of that has to do with somewhat discriminatory policies in land use as well, which we'll get into later on in the semester. But this social preference for roads being for moving people and goods at high speed means that roads are dangerous for pedestrians and cyclists. People aren't conditioned to look for them. There's not always a safe place for you to ride or walk along the side of the road. And it's just not that way in a lot of other cultures. In many countries in Western Europe, residential areas have an average speed limit of about 19 miles per hour. And on other roads in urban areas, it's like 31 miles per hour. So, whereas you have people driving 45, 55, 65 miles per hour through residential areas in places like Las Vegas. We just haven't designed the roads for anything other than people in cars. There's also a societal preference to not engage in stronger screening for access to firearms. There's a belief in the United States that the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. That's written in the Second Amendment, but people interpret that to mean that there should be absolutely no restrictions whatsoever to the right to bear arms or the right to purchase firearm. And that's just something that doesn't exist in a lot of other cultures, and because of that we have high rates of firearm homicide and suicide, among other reasons. So I've talked about a lot of stuff today that hasn't necessarily been very sunny or very encouraging, so I'm going to give you some good news here as we get toward the end. I'm talking about conditions here in the United States. Deaths from injuries has decreased substantially over the last 100 plus years. We're having a lot fewer deaths, total and also per capita, from falls, fires, drowning, firearms, even though that's not gone down as much as we'd like to, based on the prevalence of firearms in our culture, burns, and also poisoning by gas and vapors. There's also been a substantial decrease in motor vehicle deaths. This is in spite of the fact that there are more vehicles on the road and more vehicle miles driven now than at any time in history before. But because of safer road designs and safer car designs, total motor vehicle deaths have decreased. Unfortunately, we're starting to see a big increase in unintentional injury death from overdoses, which is something we'll talk about in a future lecture. Some of these decreases I've talked about are due to, again, an increase in safety accompanied by industrialization. We're more aware of occupational hazards now. We're aware of how to make transportation safer. We're making homes safer. We're making heating systems safer and less likely to catch fire, for example. Once people are injured, there's less of a risk of dying because we've kind of gotten better at tertiary care, getting people the medical help they need quickly. Again, we're talking about pre-COVID. During the COVID-19 pandemic, when hospitals are overwhelmed and crowded, it's probably not as good of a time to be trying to get tertiary care. And we've increased the use of science-based injury control strategies, which has only helped. So an important take-home message from this module is that the public health model shown here really does work well for injury control and prevention, just like it works well for infectious and chronic disease prevention. The three core functions of public health are assessment, policy development, and assurance. In this case, whether you're talking about injury control and prevention, disease prevention, you want to define the problem, identify risk and protective factors, that's assessment. You want to develop and test prevention strategies, that's policy development. And then you want to assure widespread adoption, that's assurance. So in final summary and closing, injuries are not unpredictable and unavoidable. Society does play a large role in some of the injury rates that we still have to this day. We could do some things societally to reduce injury rates and make this a much safer society where people don't have to live in under such a threat of being injured and dying. But there have been some choices that have been made, and some of them I think could stand to be unmade. We talked about those earlier. Injuries are a leading cause of death in those from 1 to 44 years old, and a leading cause of years of potential life lost. They're also costly and a major drain on our healthcare system. Again, there are a number of reasons why injury prevention is neglected, but it's the role of public health to shed light, bring attention, and come up with solutions to the problem. We can't just point to the way society is and say society is flawed. If we don't have solutions to bring to the table as well, people aren't going to listen to our messages. So always keep that in mind. So that's it for this week. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns.